So, and welcome. It's already lecture 10. Next week we have a guest lecture, our last guest lecture for this year. And I think then it's the second part of today's lecture, and then we're more or less already done. So I hope that is in your interest. I was trying to get the camera to look at me at all times. Good. What are we going to do today? First, a little reminder to please make sure that you are registered for the exam, or that you, because we're offering this course to a lot of study programs. I don't know which one you're in. I don't know about the specifics of the process. Please be reminded or notified that you have to check and make sure that you can really participate in the exam. Second, news. Already sent a few emails. Please give us feedback for this course. It's supposedly anonymous. You can either scan the QR code, you can click the link, or you can go back to the StudIP messages, and I think we also put them on Matrix, but I'm not sure. There's also a link. I think we have until the end of this week to provide feedback, if I'm not mistaken. So let us know what we can do better, but also let us know what you liked. Because if we don't know that you like this particular part or that this was really good, then we might remove it. So positive and negative aspects very much appreciated. Great pointer. You can also do it on the side, like it's not super difficult questions. Essentially, you just have to say everything is perfect at all points, and then you're done within a minute or so. So yeah, feel free to do it now. I'll hide this fucking pointer. Good, no pointer for this lecture. So then let's get started. So we've been a little bit busy with the circular economy in the last few lectures. So on one hand, the online MOOC part about linear economy, circular economy, performance economy. Then Daniel Goldman gave a lecture on developing circularity, where we slowly made the shift towards circular societies. And then you also had the MOOC content for circular societies from a different perspective. And now we're going to follow up on that, because one of the, besides all its advantages, one of the disadvantages of the circular economy is that it essentially just tries to fix an existing problem, but not the root of the problem. So you have, if you very much simplify the circular economy in one sentence or two, is essentially the goal that you want to decouple growth from the depletion or consumption of natural resources or the damage towards society. But you still have this idea of eternal economic growth that we can just continue as we do right now, but without having to worry about the environment or resource depletion or any of the nasty problems that we're currently facing. And that sounds amazing on paper. It also sounds like a great remedy, but if you think about it, it essentially leads back to the sandbox example that I gave a while back. You have a finite system that's just not something where you can do infinite growth. So even if you manage to have a 100% perfect circular society where you only use resources that you get back from recycling or anything else, you have a perfect performance economy, you repair, reuse the shit out of every product and service, even then you can't do infinite growth in a finite system. It just gives you more time until you somehow cross boundaries. And another aspect that the circular economy essentially inherits from the linear economy and just the capitalistic system in itself is that it is not really concerned with the aspect of having extreme inequality when it comes, for example, to the distribution of wealth, the distribution of resources that you just need for your life, like fresh, clean water, for example, or a roof over your head. And the same goes for education, power dynamics, and so on and so on. So in a circular economy, it's still fine that Elon Musk has 400 billions, and a large chunk of the population of this planet lives in extreme poverty. And the same with like access to education, to voting, and so on and so on. So this circular economy essentially says this is not our business, but this is where circular societies have a more prominent role. So essentially these two things, that you can't do infinite growth in a finite system, and that the circular economy pretty much ignores all the social and how do you say that? Community-based aspects of our economic system is essentially the two main criticisms of the circular economy. And even though the circular society is advocating to fix that, it's not per se suggesting the solution right away. So today we will try at some potential building blocks that could be part of this transition, or like how this could be happening. Neither of them is with that you can just say, yeah, this is perfect, we're gonna do it. Each of those building blocks in itself has complex pros and cons. Putting them together is complex, and then there's still probably quite a lot of stuff missing, because I can do a whole lecture series just on, okay, how can we maybe build a better future? But we have 2 lectures for that. So I think I jumped through some of the slides already I had while talking. When we have these 2 main downsides of the circular economy, you can then either try to fix them somehow internally, or you can ask or start asking the question, like, why do we even have this tendency to ask for eternal economic growth? Like, if you're like, to me as a kid, it seemed to be quite strange. Before I understood, okay, there's an economic money system, you need 3% inflation, blah, 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 blah. And it's a built-in feature that you always, of the finance system, that you always need to make more money in order to stay within the system. It was quite weird to me to say, okay, why do we always need more? Certainly, 1 bathtub is enough. What am I gonna do with 2, 3, 4 bathtubs? Admittedly, I was 5 or 6, but the same logic can be applied, especially since you also have a hard limit of what you can consume per any given day or hour or time unit of your choice. Because you have a 24-hour day that leaves you, I don't know how many moments in time to consume something, but you can only do it so long. So let's say every thing that you consume, every Reddit post that you scroll through, everything on Facebook, every meme on the internet, consuming food, consuming a plane flight, consuming being in the bathtub, like there's only a limited amount of consumption that you can put into your system. And even if you try to maximize this, the question still remains, does it still provide you the utility that you were hoping for? Like, why are you scrolling Reddit? Probably for entertainment purposes. And if you now have to do this on purpose very fast so that you can consume it, but you don't use it anymore, you don't utilize it anymore, then it also becomes a little bit pointless. So those are just like some perspectives to look at this question, why we need eternal economic growth, or whether we really need it. And you can also probably do a whole economics lecture on the backgrounds of that. But essentially, we're trying to use this question a little bit as a starting point for some of the building blocks later. Because while we're trained to always want more, bigger salary, bigger house, more modern car, new smartphone, high-end computer, whatever, in most cases you don't really need it. Like, sure, there's like special applications where you really need a high-end thing, but most of us can probably do with much less, especially since the utility difference in having a good computer and an extremely high-end, very good computer usually doesn't add as much happiness, as much positive things that you want to get out of it as like the first part. So having a computer in the first place makes you way more happy than having the best computer in the world. Sure, it can make you a little bit more happy, especially if you have niche interests like, I don't know, high-end overclocking of CPUs. But speaking of a general direction here. So if it's not consuming more, what's the alternative, or what could be alternative goals? Asking yourself what is enough, like when am I happy? One's now going into psychology direction without any further details. But essentially there is a curve that is in the beginning quite steep, because when you have nothing, you're very happy about a glass of water. If you know that you have a glass of water or as much water as you need, you have maybe food as your next priority, or a roof over your head, or some kind of housing, and later you build like this pyramid of needs that you need. You add more complex stuff like education, hospitals, healthcare, retirements and blah, 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 so you essentially add complexity on top. But each of those then gives you a little bit less than the initial glass water or the fact that you have a roof over your head in the first place. So what is enough to have a happy life? Do you really need to be Elon and have 400 billions and fly dick-shaped rockets into space? Or is it maybe fine with some level of comfort below that? And a lot of these proposals there, or a lot of the ideas in this space are related to so-called sufficiency strategies, not trying to get the optimum or asking how much I can get, but what do I really need? It also has then implications on, of course, the whole economic system, because if we don't consume ourselves to death anymore, the economy will suffer, but also towards the structure of how the economy works. Because right now, you're computer scientists, you probably at least secretly dreamed about a startup that you can found and then sell it for a few billions or become the next Google CEO or the next Google itself. But all of those, or most of the motivations behind those ideas then are very much money-driven or power-driven or influence-driven. And the question is it really necessary? Because collaboration to achieve a certain goal, a shared goal, doesn't really require a shareholder concept. We have a broken greenhouse roof right now. The task is to solve that. We come together, we build the greenhouse, everyone profits, done. There's a very much different approach from the perspective of solving problems. If you run a startup now, your goal is to make as much money as possible for you, because you might be the main shareholder, or for your other shareholders who invested in that. You're not particularly interested in solving a problem, you're interested in amassing wealth. Whether this is by solving someone else's problem is a different thing. While the other side of the perspective is we do what we need to do to get, or to keep everything going, to solve the problems that keep us from being on a reasonable happiness level, but we're not pursuing anything beyond that. Which also sounds extremely stupid. You've done everything you need to be happy or to be on a reasonable happiness level, and then you have the task to do more, just to be even a little bit more happy. And if you do that as well, there's also slightly more happiness to gain. And essentially, the happiness increased and tempers out a little bit. Good, long story short, what are alternatives to just try to make eternal economic growth inside a finite system happen, and having further people like Elon with 400 billions while everyone else suffers? One of the key concepts that we're going to build on top is so-called eco-sufficiency, because sufficiency can also be applied in other contracts, so we are explicitly talking about eco-sufficiency here. Eco-sufficiency is composed of, in itself, some other aspects. The first one is eco-efficiency, and that's quite straightforward. You try to minimize the material input required to achieve a certain economic result. For example, to improve the ratio between the use of resources and the production of goods. And an extremely simple example could be a combustion fuel car. A car that needs 3 liters to drive 100 kilometers is 2 times more ecologically efficient than a car that consumes 6 liters. So quite simple. You do efficiency optimization for the sake of the environment. So the maximization factor or the optimization parameter is here the utility to save the environment. So that's quite simple. Same when you go for the insulation of a house, or I'm not really creative today, so sorry. I should maybe spend more time sleeping. Eco-consistency being the second building block. So we had eco-efficiency, now eco-consistency. And the ecological consistency is based on the damage intensity and environmental impact of the resources used. Instead of reducing their quantity, their nature or the product design should be optimized so that no emissions or waste are produced regardless of the level of consumption. So that is like having heavily overlaps with a circular economy. Example, when you need to drive, you choose the option that is essentially the least ecologically damaging. Probably based on what we've learned in the LCA lecture, that's going to be a battery electric vehicle. And in best case, it's not charged with burned penguins, but rather something like wind solar energy. Or you just push it. And if you combine eco-efficiency and eco-consistency, you could, if we stick with our examples, first minimize the fuel or energy consumption of a car so that it needs as little energy as possible to move you from A to B, no matter whether it's hydrogen, electricity, horse-based, or fuel-based. And then the second step, you operate the car with the most carbon-neutral fuel or energy, whatever that might be. So you have essentially two optimization constraints then. And let's finally get to the eco-sufficiency. Seeking enough when more is possible is both intuitive and rational. Personally, organizationally, and ecologically. And under global ecological constraints, it's also ethical. That's at least what a guy called Thomas Princeton says. As always, we have multiple definitions from multiple sources to just get an idea like how different people talk about it, what are the different perspectives. The IPCC, so also the people who gave you these nice numbers, for example, what happens when we have 2 degrees global warming, we'll have this much temperature increase. So essentially the people from the UN who compiled this really nice report on climate change on a regular basis. And they define eco-sufficiency as a set of policy measures and daily practices that avoid the demand for energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources, while providing well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. So essentially, we have this budget of any given resource, also including environmental damage. We're 8 billion people. We divide that budget by 8 billion. This is what everyone gets. Done. Not more, not less. Less would be possible, but definitely not more. And not Elon taking that big chunk, and then the next 5 billion people taking the same chunk together. So that's the IPCC version. I think we have a third one. No, that's just a short version. All you need is less. Also a title of a book by accident, as I learned later, that is also concerned with sufficiency concepts. So eco-sufficiency, because we had example for eco-efficiency, for eco-consistency, now the eco-sufficiency example. You are students, you might already moved out at home, or you will at some point move out, and then you're looking for a new apartment. You have done requirements engineering in our research group, and that means you know that you already have to predefine what the requirements for your new product, in this case your apartment, are. So you have, for example, a size, you have a budget, you have an idea what kind of heating you would like to have, and so on and so on. We will just focus on size and heat demand here for the sake of our example, and we get a 120 square meter apartment, extremely big for a single person, probably even big for 2 or 3 or 4 people. You need about 130 kilowatt hours per square meter per year to keep this place lovely, warm, and cozy. So if you now think about it from the energy efficiency perspective, you can either try to live with less temperature or lower temperatures, or you can try to insulate the house and install the most highly efficient heating system that requires less heat or less energy to heat the apartment than maybe a less optimal solution. So that would be the efficiency approach. I have a house, I need to heat it, I can insulate it, or I can try to optimize how I heat it, or I can do both. Eco-consistency would be minimizing the ecological damage by choosing the most sustainable way of heating. So it's probably not burning penguins. But what else then could be the option? Like if you have green energy, then maybe it's a heat pump system where you create heat from energy, so from electric energy, or you burn something. But you try to choose the most sustainable one. What's the sufficiency approach? Exactly. Live in a smaller apartment or utilize less space per person. I mean, you can get a big-ass apartment, you just have to live there with more people, and that's also a sufficiency strategy. Personally, we have something like a 70, 75 square meter flat, so my wife, my dogs, and it's bigger than what we need. We usually don't use half of the flat. So we can live with less if the flat allows for this constellation, because not every apartment design allows for that, blah, 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 blah. But essentially, I don't really need more living space, I need more storage space because we have so many tools, so many projects, so many things we're working on, and all this stuff has to be somewhere. But you can also put that in a barn, like living space, 35, 40 square meters, totally fine. Personal, subjective note on this. Good. Problems with that approach. First, efficiency and consistency allow us to either continue living a nice life using less resources. So if we optimize everything for more efficiency, like all the cars needing less fuel or less energy to move from A to B, all the apartments are very well insulated and use less energy to heat. And if you do this like globally everywhere, then essentially you need less resources, but still can continue in a nice living, continue living in a nice way. And that's pretty much what most of the general global narrative is about. If we just make stuff more efficient, if we can recycle more, if we can heat stuff more efficiently, if we replace fuel-based engines with battery electric, that also gives us an efficiency boost. If we do X, Y, and that, then we can continue and keep everything that we like. And this is, of course, also the preferable option, because I like my standard of living. I mean, I have some complaints, but it's not really like anything big. And I would like to keep that standard of living while still not having an impact on the environment. And that's essentially where the problem starts to be a problem of scale, because we have to do that, first of all, globally, and then for 10 billion people. And the more people we are in a finite system, the more we have to constrain the resource to allow everyone to have a certain level of confidence. But the much, much bigger problem is that we tend to do, like we want to do A, but we tend to do B. And the problem is we're not just doing B, we're even going beyond B. So we're introducing a lot of new ways to be more efficient, but instead of taking those savings, putting them in our bank account, we're just taking out another loan and spending even more than we actually can. So most efficiency increases have in total led to more, like to straining more the system than it has before. So we haven't really have a net negative in most situations if you talk about this in a general sense. And one example there is one related example could be green energies. I don't know if this statement is true for every country on this planet, but it was definitely true for Germany, at least in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, or EU. But anyway, the point being that we added a shitload of green energy sources. Solar, water, wind energy, but we didn't use it to substitute the fossil fuel industry. So we have a big new chunk of solar energy and everything else that is green, but we didn't use it to cut down on fossil fuels. We just added on top. So now we have more energy to even produce more things and consume even more. So it's not a net positive, it's a net negative. We have had this efficiency improvement and we had this ways, like now we're not talking about material or energy efficiency, but about sustainability efficiency. We wanted to be more sustainable by introducing green energies, but instead of substituting, we just used more energy than ever before. And the same is true with emissions, for example. We have emission reduction technologies, but still for many, many years, emissions are steadily rising instead of finally dropping. So that's the main problem with this efficiency narrative, that yes, in theory, on paper, it works nicely, but somehow someone is always stabbing us in the back. Good. So they promise to maintain your individual freedom of choices by fixing ecological challenges or downsides using technological or political action. So personal responsibility by buying yourself out of this mess. Just buy high-price, eco-friendly products, everything is fine, and you don't need to consume less. So if you pay $50 extra then for your plane ticket, then you won't have an ecological impact, which is of course stupid. If you buy the bio food, plastic-free food in the supermarket, everything will be fine. If you spend $10 to plant new trees, everything will be fine. Essentially, everything that can be commodified about sustainability will be commodified and sold back, being sold back to you. And that combination of this, if we just make everything more efficient, and I can use my consumption power to buy something sustainability related is pretty much the reason why most people don't really move forward, because they're like, hey, that's enough, I've done something. So this is the figure that I talked about earlier, that initially the first glass of water that you're given is quite valuable in terms of survival and increases your happiness much, much stronger than having a already nice level of living where your consumption-oriented needs are more or less satisfied. So yes, sure, having that extra piece of chocolate makes you slightly more happy, but after half a kilogram of chocolate, you actually even have a decrease in happiness and utility, because chocolate is great. Too much chocolate, not so great anymore. So a very intuitive way here. And at some point, if you then consume too much, you have this overstimulation, lack of time, stress, feeling from something that is supposed to give you a utility, but at some point it just becomes a burden. You can think about that essentially with your own hobbies or stuff that you like to do. You have a lot of stuff to do for the university. It leaves you a little bit of time for your hobbies and time to relax or do something cool, but then you might want, either you're totally exhausted and can't do anything at all anymore, or you're like, okay, I want to now do a lot of cool things, but I have to squeeze them all in this short time frame. For example, even if when you do a short vacation trip, you have 2 or 3 days to do a city trip, and there are 50 things and you want to see all of them, then it's more about stress if you choose too many instead of just like doing 1 or 2 properly. Good. What I would like now to do is a short detour based on one of the consequences of having a more sufficiency-oriented economic system or a sufficiency-oriented environment. Because if we suddenly don't need infinite growth anymore, we also don't need to essentially have a lifestyle oriented towards what do I need. You're suddenly going to get rid of, that's pretty much all the marketing departments in the world, all the salespeople in the world, because if I'm buying what I need, I don't need ads to be shoved up in my face to buy more of that, because I already then have a car and then I'm happy for the next time. And long story short, this whole sufficiency, we just do what we need, leads to obviously a lot less workforce being required, because we don't have to produce all that excess anymore that we had before. The economic system just tailored towards needs and not overconsumption is much simpler and has much less output than a full-scale economic system as we have it right now. So what's going to happen with all those people? Because you can be unsatisfied with working for a fossil fuel company, but you're still not quitting because someone needs to put food in your fridge. Or you maybe need a house, or you maybe need education. So you're still doing that. It's often like one of these reasons why people don't do something for the sustainability, despite knowing that their actions are harmful, because they have economic needs that need to be met in terms of food, safety, security, blah, blah, blah. So starting from this assumption, what if we have a sufficiency-oriented society? What do we do with all that leisure time? And is it really bad that then suddenly we have less work available? Because right now everyone's quite busy. I guess you've either already survived all of your exams or you're about to do so. And you're probably stressed. There's so much stuff to do and it's not going to get less. So everyone is somehow being overworked. Despite the fact that we're having all of this efficiency increases already. So based on this assumption, what do we do? If everything is just sufficiency oriented, what do we do with work? And is it really, with the workforce, and is it really so bad if we have less to do? And also, do we really need all the stuff that we're doing right now? Because that is something that a guy called David Graeber looked into in one of his books. Graeber is an anthropology professor, or was one because he's dead now, from London, if I'm not mistaken, or at least that's where he was at the university. And he wrote quite a few interesting books. So can recommend some of his talks. They're quite entertaining. Or you can get the gist of one of his books now, because we're using it as a foundation thesis to continue now. Just as a quick reminder, we always had this mantra, consuming less is the most sustainable thing you can do. If you consume less, you need less resources, you cause less damage, but you also need less money. being spent, and that also somehow then lowers your living costs if you just are sufficient with a base set of happiness or utility. Lower living cost usually means that you have to work less. There's also the side effect of you consuming less means that there is less work required from the industry side. So you need less money, less work hours because you just need less money, but the industry also needs to ask for a less workforce because you don't have to produce as much anymore. So instead of working 40 hours a week on paper and then 60 in reality, you could work something like 20 hours a week or 15 or 10 random numbers now just for the sake of making an example. But the number, okay, sorry, forgot about that part. Despite the fact that more and more people seem to be overworked, not just like personal opinion, but also foundations in psychology studies or social science studies, it is quite a contrast towards what most of technology promises nowadays. Because that, like all the technological advancements that we made in the last 100 years should theoretically have only contributed to us having to work less. Like we invented the steam engine, we went to the combustion engine. Like all the stuff without this would have been done by, I don't know, horses or people. But we already saved quite a lot of that. Now the AI boom is supposedly also making things more efficient for us. We can write emails faster, we can write more beautiful, we may not even have to write in the first place, we don't need to translate something by hand, blah, 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 blah. So pure success story for 100 years of massive efficiency increases. And still, we work more than we used to do in the past, which is weird and shouldn't happen. John Maynard Keynes, one of the gods of economics, predicted a 15-hour work week in his 1930 essay, Economics Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, within the next 100 years. Because he looked at the economy back then, he looked at what technology is already doing because he lived in this time where you had an enormous efficiency shift due to extreme advancements in technology. Like think about it, like for 100 years ago, like flying something was more or less out of the questions, and within 100 years, you're essentially on your way to Mars. And this is like he was living in one of the fastest moving times there. He looked at the economy and said, okay, with all this technological stuff, looking at what the people are doing now by hand, manually, can be mostly automated. And then, of course, you need a few people maintaining those machines, building the machines, keeping everything running. But by his estimate, like instead of working 40, 60, 80 hours a week, 15 hours totally fine for everyone, and we could then still have an increase in wealth and happiness. There have been, of course, lively debates pertaining to Keynes' predictions, especially among the economists, because that's not really the goal of an economy, to make sure that you can work less. It is about maximizing shareholder profit. So that prediction didn't really, like this, at least it wasn't the goal for them, to have people only work 15 hours a week. That means they still have at least 25 hours left. What are they going to do with that? The main problem was that Keynes did not, so essentially, that's I guess just as one thought why it's of course very controversial with the economists. But Keynes had one main problem, or something that he probably couldn't really predict that made his prediction more difficult, is that he did not account for the massive increase in consumerism. He couldn't see, and intuitively I think it's very easy to follow that assumption, is why people would continuously increase their consumptions above that figure where we had this peak in the middle. Why would people do this? Very unintuitive, not very rational, and therefore also very difficult to predict, because now we're consuming more than actually makes us happy. Why would we work more to have then less free hours and then also not getting the pleasure that we're looking for? So it contradicts our sustainability paradigm, obviously, because we're working in the direction of consuming less as the most sustainability or most promising sustainability action. And when Keynes made that prediction, he could see parts of this figure probably in less accuracy, because getting those numbers back then was more difficult than just asking ChatGPT. And it is supposed to illustrate how labor force, workforce or the distribution has shifted throughout the last 160, 170 years. Initially, of course, a lot of people were busy in agriculture because this is where a lot of work needs to be done in order to feed everyone. With all the efficiency improvements, technological advancements, you essentially are now managing to feed many, many more people with much less workforce. So we have now almost 10 billion people, but almost none of them are working in the agricultural sector anymore because we're mostly talking about large-scale systems, hundreds of hectares, if not thousands of hectares of farms being operated by a small consortium, mostly machines, mostly automated. So you have a radical shift there. So we had like situations like this before where we're asking, okay, if technology takes over, what happens to all those people in those jobs right now? So what if AI automates all of us away? What's gonna happen? Probably something like this, just with the AI or certain service sectors there instead of the agriculture sector. And back then, essentially a lot of the people from losing their jobs or their occupations in the agricultural sector then went into the service and industrial sector. Industrial also at some point had a dip or started to decrease, pretty much for the same reason as in the agricultural sector. Everything done by hand, manually, by humans, can be in various ways being automated away or at least heavily supported by machines. So just imagine putting a car together by hand or having these huge manufacturing lines doing a big chunk of this work for a human. Those kind of increases, and everyone else then ended somehow in the service sector. So economic system found a way to utilize the workforce that was freed from one task and assign them to another. In his book, which he called a little bit provocative bullshit jobs, which first was an essay that you can read in short, or you can of course also read the whole book if you like. He looked at the utility and usefulness of work being done, especially in the service sector. Because with the agricultural space and also a lot, like in large chunks, the industrial space, you can very simply argue, yeah, okay, it fulfills a certain level of sense, or it makes a certain level of sense, it fulfills a need, it provides a utility, while this is more difficult with large chunks of the service sector. So this is what he focused most on. And it essentially started for him, not really as a research project, but more as like a personal experience, that he had more and more the feeling that as a university professor, more and more tasks seem to arrive on his desk that are that are solely designed to somehow keep him busy, not being able to do his actual work. And I can attest to that. I often feel that way. So it hasn't really changed that much. So he posted on his Twitter and asked people like, hey, do you have jobs where it feels like I'm paraphrasing now to make it a little longer, where you feel like that if you would stop doing that, the world wouldn't be a worse place? Or do you have the feeling that all you're doing doesn't really matter and has no point? Give me examples, or am I just essentially the only person feeling like that? And he got quite a few responses that gave amazing illustrations that first then were the foundation for this essay, and then later the book is essentially collecting more research data, making this broader, and then the continuation of the essay. In the essay, he tried to give this provocative title, bullshit job, a definition, or to somehow constrain it, like what does he mean by that? Because it would be quite mean on one hand, but also very difficult for me to go to you and just say, what you're doing is a bullshit job because I think so. Those are my reasons that your job is bullshit. So he formed essentially the other way around. A bullshit job is a job, like it's bullshit if the person doing that job makes those characterizations. So it's a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. So essentially you're getting paid, you have the feeling, or you already know that no matter what you're going to put in that Excel spreadsheet, it's not going to matter at all. It's just to keep you busy. It's just for you to get a certificate, to get credit points, to get a point. Maybe sitting in this lecture is part of this experience. That is then a bullshit job. The only difference here now is you're not getting paid to attend this lecture. You're actually paying for that, so this is like a nice tweak for me. Good, but you get the idea. If you feel like this doesn't really contribute to anything, then you're potentially in a bullshit job position. Something like this should not exist. If we have a capitalistic system, and this is one of the things that he's now investigating in the essay as well as in the book later, this thing should not exist. Because capitalism is about finding the most, like market efficiency. Like the market is supposed to find the most efficient solution for any given problem. And a solution can't be that I have more people than actually need to solve a problem and that I'm keeping them busy with pointless tasks. So why does that still happen? And he collected so many examples that he even managed to put them in different categories because he got so many input from all his followers, from people on the internet, from other academics who had similar questions, so that he had to start categorizing all these jobs. One simple approach to determine whether your job might be a little bit pointless or not as productive or meaningful as you might think is, of course, a little bit limited in its application, but essentially to ask what would happen if you stop working for a month? Would the world be worse or a better place? And he also gave some examples in the essay and the book. For example, teacher strike. Makes quite a difference if all the teachers in the country go on a strike for a month. Even worse, people who clean up after you. So if the trash is not getting emptied or not being transported away from cities, you probably already have a quite big problem, not only after a month, but already after a week, max. If the water supply stops, you will notice. If hospitals close, you will notice. Will you really notice if hedge fund managers stop existing? Would you really notice if the marketing department disappears? Sure, you would notice because you're getting less ads shoved up in your face. But would it be really a worse place to get rid of all the marketing executives and the marketing people, or would it be at least neutral outcome? Of course, this gives a little bit of wiggle room. Would it matter if all the researchers at this university disappeared for a month? I would argue not a lot of people would notice. However, there might be one brilliant researcher among these people here that's going to make an extreme breakthrough in the future, and him not continuing research any further might give you false results. So that rule of thumb is not quite clear. So let's go to the categories. Flunkies, they serve to make their superiors feel important. Something like having a receptionist, an administrative assistant, a door attendant, a store greeter, makers of websites whose site neglect ease of use and speed for look, something along that line. So Nelly could now ask herself whether the fact that she's sitting here makes her job fall into the flunky category. But I hope it's not the case because she's also actively listening for the first time to this lecture and learning about this concept. And she's not just here to make me look important or powerful or relevant because I have people setting up stuff for me that makes me relevant, that makes me feel powerful. But keep that in mind. This is not the case, but please keep that example in mind for later because we'll need to get back to it. Next category, goons. They act to harm or devise others on behalf of their employer. Lobbyists, corporate lawyers, telemarketeers, public relations specialists, community managers, something along those lines. Before we continue, saying that people within those jobs can be bullshit jobs doesn't mean that all of them are, because the receptionist in a hotel serves a purpose. The receptionist is not just there to make sure that the hotel looks relevant. They do something. They provide you maybe more value than a broken chat AI bot for one of those automated hotels that breaks down if the Wi-Fi goes down. So just because they're listed here doesn't mean that all of them are shit. Good, duct tapers. Temporarily fix problems that could be fixed permanently. For example, programmers repairing bloated code, airline staff who calms passengers whose bags do not arrive instead of making sure that they arrive. I think, yeah, let's maybe first before I go to example. And box tickers. They create the appearance that something useful is being done when it's not. Survey administration, in-house magazine journalists, corporate compliance officers, quality service managers, and so on and so on. And with many of those examples, I personally, you might feel different, can relate, especially when it comes to keeping people busy, filling out an unnecessary large amount of paperwork for all kind of stuff. There are various tasks where I don't really think that this is of any value. Not going into details on Stundenzettel or like our ratings now, because that might get me in trouble. Good, so essentially various jobs that he was able to put in different categories. There are also implications that are a little bit more complex there. So you could, for example, argue that military and police force and border control personnel could also fall into this category. Because essentially you have military because someone else has a military. If no one has military, no one would need it anymore. So like there are some corner cases where you can argue whether this makes sense or not sense, but it's also like a book on a very provocative thesis then leading to something else. So take it with a smile. And last, taskmasters. They create extra work for those who do not need it, mostly middle management. So think about whether you really want to go there, because this is usually where you stop also doing what you actually are good at, e.g., for example, senior developer or something, and get into something that you are not really made for. So for example, I like to think that I got this job because I'm a good researcher and maybe a not so bad teacher. But most of my work now is being essentially something like a mail pigeon. Most of the time I sit in meetings. I advise people on how to do something or discuss with them. I write shitloads of emails. I'm in so many more meetings after that, and then I'm doing a lot of very pointless administrative stuff, and then the 5% of my time left is when I can actually do research. So middle management is the point where you essentially cross what you're good at, what you're qualified for, what you love, and then do something somewhere else. Good, but this is just a side note. And how do now jobs that once were supposed to be serving a purpose become bullshit job? That's what you call bullshitization. So the transition of a meaningful job into a bullshit job through corporatization, marketization, or management practices. This was supposed to be a little bit bigger, but okay, we'll try to work with that. So he also got a little bit of data together. Sure, we're now picking like some examples here because we can't do a comprehensive survey, but he got some numbers on the full-time staff size for his faculty and university and compared it to the student enrollments. And we have 1976, 2011, 2018, and then in between the percentages for increase or decrease. So can you read how many people were in the faculty, or should I read out the numbers? Okay, good. So then I will just take some minor examples here. So faculty increased from 400,000 to 760,000, increase of 70-60%. And if you then even compare it to 2018, then you have something like 92%. So it almost doubled. Similarly, executive or administration increased by 140 to 164%. Other professionals working there increased by even almost 400% or 450%. But the student enrollments did not keep track or did not stay in the same realm. So we're talking about 91% to 78% over that same period. So what are all those extra people doing? You could argue, of course, that the system was heavily understaffed before 1976, and then that now what we have in 2018 is the fair number that should have been reached. That's one possible explanation here. An alternative explanation is that more and more people got involved with the goal of getting more stuff done and maybe providing better or more services to the students, but more people also meet more organizational overhead. And when you get into this corporatization management thing where you suddenly don't have a 5-person team, but a 50-person team, then more and more inefficiencies get introduced to the point where the inefficiencies accumulate so much that you need someone to manage the inefficiencies. Good, long story short, heavy increase in staff, not in correspondence with the students, and also not in correspondence with the service increase provided towards the students. So the teaching quality didn't get 400% better. So having more work for an unproportional amount of extra students contradicts what Keynes says. Of course, like just one example, but it pretty much is in line with what he said. The examples that I gave before, when we compared where we have been 100 years ago and where we are now in terms of technological efficiency improvements, also support Keynes' statement, of course, at least like on a higher level. Like we have had tremendous technological breakthroughs, but we're still not even close to a 15-hour work week. If we're lucky, we'll have a 4-day work week, but then you're still like far, far away from a 15-hour work week. So why did that still not happen? What's the reason here? Based on the assumption that capitalism shouldn't allow for that we get less and less efficient, he was looking for alternative explanations, or he was looking for explanations to explain this phenomena, because this is not an explanation, that's just an assumption. So he made, as an anthropologist, the assumption, and will at some point, I promise, make this connection back to technology. He made the hypothesis that maybe it's that what we're experiencing right now is not pure capitalism, or not capitalism in itself at all, and rather something like a manager feudalism. So something that you had in the Middle Ages when you had kings and others. So you had one hierarchy person at the top, and everyone else was somehow dependent on that. I appoint now Nelly as one of my higher-ups and give her a part of the land. In exchange, she will manage that land and make sure that I get enough tax money out of this or any other resources that I need. Nelly can later decide to maybe also subdivide her tasks by giving them to someone else and giving them some land to do so, but essentially something like that. And you can probably clearly see like the analogy between a management system where you have a lot of hierarchy to structure something and this feudal system in the first place. Why this difference is relevant is something we'll get back to at the end. But essentially, the thought that despite having a mostly capitalist-driven market system, we have these inefficiencies might indicate that we have moved on from this idea of capitalism or are now in a different economic system, which has different applications and different rules, and therefore would also be relevant for our circular economy, is a thought that he's now trying to follow. So just for your, as a side note, what's the definition of feudalism? And getting back to the actual point. So his hypothesis is, okay, it's not capitalism anymore, it's something else. What is it? The pains of dull work as a justification for the ability to fulfill later consumer desires. So you sitting in this lecture, you are listening to stupid other lectures, you are doing pointless homeworks, you're still doing it because you're expecting a reward for that will then later cash out in some kind of consumption tokens in form of money for you. You're doing this for a reason. Fulfilling those desires is a reward for your suffering through pointless work. So essentially, you're willing to ruin your health, your life, your future now in exchange for having a lot of money later. That's why you're suffering now. That's more a mechanism how this could work, like what's the incentive system behind that. But bullshit jobs also serve in some kind of political means. Not said, of course, that someone designed it that way. This is just something that happens, and now the anthropologist examines what kind of, like, why did this become a stable thing and did not evolve to something else yet? So that's like what anthropologists do. So bullshit jobs also serve a political ends in which political parties are more concerned about having jobs than whether those jobs are fulfilling. And this is probably something that you will be able to witness now in the upcoming election in Germany. There are promising jobs, but no one ever mentions what jobs and whether you actually want to do these jobs, whether they are meaningful, whether they are contributing to society, or whether they are just destroying the society, or whether they are just supposed to be there to keep you busy. Because busy people don't do revolutions. It's just like, of course, one extreme example, but you get the idea. As a politician, I'm interested in giving you a job. I don't care whether you like it or not. You have to be thankful that you have a job in the first place, because otherwise you're once again back to your basic needs that are not fulfilled. Now what? Graeber argues, okay, now that we seem to have a substantial amount of work that either is completely pointless or even actually harmful, and having all of this efficiency increases, why are we still doing this? Like, what would be alternatives? And this is now where we're getting our connection back to the sufficiency thing. If the work that I'm doing to keep what I need to eat is pointless, why are we doing it as a society in the first place? And what would be alternative models? And after, I think like something 250 pages, Graeber, as a professor and someone who likes to talk, gets finally to his building block that he would like to propose in order to address those issues, is a universal basic income. So for those of you who have never heard it, in German it's Grundeinkommen, and the idea is essentially to give you something like a livable benefit paid to everyone, no matter whether you're unemployed or having a CEO job, thus letting people work at their leisure. Or in less extreme cases, like it's not just I work at my leisure, it's more like I work as long as there's stuff that needs to be done, and then afterwards I'm free to do whatever I like. There are extreme diversity of those UBI solutions, because mostly the most prominent and like closer to the original idea, UBI was something like we pay something from society to you so that like you are good to go. So not just bare existential minimum, but slightly more, so that it's not just suffering or living in hell, but slightly more. And that's pretty much it. Of course, you can also use it to cut off all other governmental funding. So you get your UBI, but from that you have to survive essentially on your own. No public health insurance, no unemployment government, blah, 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 essentially cutting everything off that the social security system otherwise provides to you. You get $1,000, that's it. Now you're on your own, see you next month. Like that's one spectrum, and the other one, of course, then going into, when I was young, there was one political party advertising, how do you translate that? Wealth for everyone, Reichtum für alle, which doesn't really work. So this category is as dubious as some other categories. So, but yeah, what I'm trying to say is you have a large spectrum of how UBIs could be implemented just from what they would like to provide. And Graeber essentially argues, if we just divide the work necessary to be done, and we make sure that this is covered, pay everyone a UBI, then we don't have these weird occurrences anymore that are people doing jobs that don't need to be done. We're having less jobs that are damaging towards the environment. We can go more in the sufficiency direction because we're not looking to consume as much as possible anymore for no good reason. So he's essentially trying to cluster a lot of things together with a little bit of patchwork in between, and then proposes UBIs as one potential solution that you could go into. There are, of course, a lot of questions, and we'll go into that next week, with regards to UBI, like where is the money coming from? If no one works anymore, who's going to fund that UBI? And how many people are really going to use it to not work at all anymore and sit just at home and not doing shit anymore? Or are people still going to go to work? Are they going to work with the same effort? Are they going to work with less effort? Would a ExxonMobil or Apple CEO really stop showing up to work just because they're paying $1,000 per month? Probably not. But where is this magic line? Like, would I still go and walk my ass off as a waitress or as a waiter for 16 hours a day being paid less than minimum wage and also, I don't know, being yelled at by my boss? Probably not. So different implications, different research parts that also go in there, and we'll look a little bit into that next week as one of the potential building blocks. What I wanted to achieve with this lecture was to give you a little bit of this introduction to sufficiency of having enough, and then also providing a little bit of a perspective on this from an economic corrupted system approach or perspective. Because we're always arguing like, okay, we have to work, we all have to work, otherwise we'll all starve to death, wealth will collapse. That's not really necessarily true. And the fact that now, like from a scientific basis, because he put that in papers, like, hey, I got all the numbers, that you can prove or show that a larger and growing amount of work seems to not serve any purpose, which then has a lot of like bad implications, because if you're working all the time thinking that it's not worth what you're doing, that also has an impact on your mental health. If you feel like, I'm suffering here, but I'm doing this 10 hours a week, that's not going to be very helpful for you. So it also has a lot of downsides for society if you have suddenly a lot of burned out, bored out, or depressed people. So essentially, how can you address this? What are means to adapt towards that system? What are system changes that could potentially solve this? So we have people doing pointless stuff that doesn't seem to be necessary anymore. We seem to have more workforce thanks to technological advances than we actually need. So let them be. Don't force them into being busy just because this has been the way it always been. So, and that's even not true, because this is what it has been since the Industrial Revolution started. Before that, and this now really goes far beyond this lecture, you had other systems. So just because we're used to the fact that we're always supposed to work more, to consume more, doesn't mean that this is a law of nature. This can be changed, and Graeber looking into one direction how to change that. So UBI, one solution on the way he makes this assumption or this hypothesis that we're not actually having a capitalistic system anymore, but rather a managerial feudalism is what he calls it, which essentially boils down to the fact that a lot of non-necessary work comes from more and more managing and bureaucracy being involved in this fully corporatization of every aspect of our life, meaning that you need a lot more people to manage people, but in that somehow process it also appears that a lot of more work being done that is not really necessary. And one of his explanations is that we're not trying to make as much money as possible, but become as powerful as possible, and then we can make this connection back to this feudalism system. So it would be bad for me to lose Nelly as my employee, because I have more power, I'm more relevant, the more employees I have. So even if our research group becomes less and less efficient when I'm getting more and more employees, because we're getting more and more grant proposals, we're working more and more hours, we're getting more and more blah, 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 doesn't mean that we get more stuff done or that we're doing better research. So maybe scaling down to 3 or 4 people is more efficient in terms of output than having 20 people. Maybe, like this can be true in the research context. Or maybe it's also just enough to have 4 people thinking hard about stuff, and you don't need 20 people working on various topics, because you can't focus all of them on the same thing anyway. I know there's like a little bit of wiggle room in my line of argumentation, but you essentially get the idea. I don't want to give Nelly away, even if I might not need her anymore, because that would make me less powerful in this managerial hierarchy of our system. So I don't care whether it's efficient to have Nelly working on something, but I care about having her, because everything else would decrease my importance. There are, of course, more in detail explanations of all of that stuff that I just tried to put into a 60-minute talk. Questions, I would say we'll do in 10 minutes, so 2:35 to just make it simple. We're gonna stop the recording now. As I said, I'm already quite interested in feedback. Did that make sense, or did I lose you somewhere? So you can think about that while grabbing your next coffee or beverage of your choice. No exercise today, just quick Q&A session, and then you're good to go. Next week we have the last invited lecture. Gabriel from the Cat Farm is coming again, this time different topic as last year, so you can read or watch the Cat Farm stuff from last time, but it's going to be something new this year, so please stay tuned.